Hello everyone, this is Anissa Ginja Art Channel, and today I want to share with you one of the lectures from my course on rendering characters in Marmoset. This course is really useful. There are a lot of people who has already took it and they were very grateful to me for making this course. So this is like a small entrance to this course, so you can watch this one of the most important lectures here. And if you want to acquire the course on the whole, you can find it on my ArtStation store. I have also uploaded a Marmoset scene with a lighting setup to my Patreon, so you can download it and check on your computer how to set up lights properly and professionally. You can find the link in the description. So this is it. I'm not going to take your attention anymore, so you're welcome to watch this lecture. And I'm going to meet you in the next video. See you! Hello everyone, welcome to today's lecture. Here we are going to discuss how to set up lights in your render scene. We will look at light sources used to illuminate the scene, such as spotlight, omnilight, directional light, and HDRI images. We will also talk about the types of light: fill light, kill light, and the rim light. Additionally, I will point out common mistakes that the beginners often make when working with lighting in their render scenes. Let's start with the light sources you can use to set up lighting in the render scene. HDRI images, spotlights, omnilight, and directional light. These are light sources available in Marmoset, where we are learning to render our characters. In Arnold and in other render engines, this light source may be named differently. We'll begin with HDRI images. First, let's clarify what it is. HDRI is a technology for handling high-quality dynamic ranges. In simple terms, it is an image that contains more information than a regular photo. Look at the image below. Here we see a sphere lit by a regular photo on the left and by an HDRI image on the right. Obviously, you can find numerous HDRI images online if you need them, but in Marmoset there is a sufficient library of HDRI images available. However, we won't use HDRI images as the only light source for the final render, because relying only on HDRI is insufficient. Yes, it is important to select carefully HDRI images, but spending too much time on it is not needed, just because the HDRI images are not going our main source of light. By the way, in Substance Painter, scene lighting is done using HDRI. The image above shows a panorama that is the standard HDRI used by default in Substance Painter. This is what you see for texturing in Substance Painter unless you intentionally change the HDRI. Why is HDRI insufficient for the final render? Lighting the scene only with an HDRI image can make the render look not interesting enough. Moreover, we lack full control over what needs to be highlighted or shadowed. We cannot properly place accents because, as I mentioned earlier, there is a limited control. However, for presentation render where you need uniform lighting, HDRI can be suitable. The image shows two renders, one using only HDRI and the other with fully adjusted lighting. When can HDRI be applied? As I mentioned, HDRI is suitable for presentation renders where uniform lighting is required. Additionally, HDRI creates reflections of the HDRI image itself on reflective surfaces like glass and glass bottles. On the left, we can see the reflection of HDRI in the sand clock. We also use HDRI as a low-intensity fill light as an additional light source to illuminate the scene overall. We will explore this shortly. Let's look at an example of the scene lighting using HDRI. On the left is a render without HDRI, and on the right is with HDRI at low intensity. As you can see, HDRI allows you to quickly and gently increase the brightness of the scene. Now let's move to the studio lights. The first type is spotlight. We use this one most frequently. In the spotlight, the light spreads through the cone as it is shown on the picture. The spread of light depends on the brightness of the spotlight, its placement, and the cone's radius. In the setting of spotlight, you can also change the light's color and the sharpness of shadows. Let's look at an example. On the left, we see a render where the scene is lit only by spotlight. In this case, the spotlight is positioned diagonally in front of the character and slightly from above. In the screenshot from the right, you can examine the placement from different camera angles. Next, let's consider how the radius of the spotlight affects the lighting. The narrower the radius is, the smaller the illuminated area will be, and the more intense and bright the light will be. A larger radius diffuses light more widely, illuminating everything within its radius. In the example above, I show an example of the render and the screenshot from Marmoset with the spotlight of a small radius, as well as one with a wide radius on the image below. Regarding the shadows created by the spotlight, you can also adjust their hardness. For 3D character renders, we almost never use hard or sharp shadows. We tend to use soft ones. The sharpness of the shadows can be adjusted by the diameter parameter in all the types of lights. In spotlight, in omni light, in directional light, whatever. On the render on the left, we see sharp shadows, while on the render on the right, we see soft shadows. You can also change the light's color. This works especially well when setting up the rim light, which I will discuss next. However, I must note that the color of the light greatly affects how the material and textures of a character will look like. This is quite evident in the renders you see now. In one case, I changed the light to pink and in the other to yellow. Moving to the OmniLight. OmniLight works as a regular light bulb. We all know how light spreads from it because we have light bulbs in our apartments. OmniLight shines in all directions and around itself. How the light falls on the character depends on the placement of the light and its brightness. Unlike the spotlight, which is limited by the cones through which light goes, the light from the OmniLight is not limited. It gradually diffuses depending on the intensity. You can also change the color of the light and the sharpness of shadows, same as in the spotlight. In these two renders, you can see how the character looks when we light it with the OmniLight first from the left and then from the right. Directional light. It works as our natural sun and gives light just like it. How a directional light shines depends on its rotation and brightness. You can also change the color of this light as well as the sharpness of shadows. I won't talk much about this light because I've never used it in practice. However, it is often used in the environment rendering. Now let's move to the types of lights in the lighting schemes. Let's review three main types: fill light, key light, and the rim light. We will talk about each of them separately. So the first one, let's start with the fill light. We begin with this one because it is the first light which we start adjusting when setting up the lights in the render scene. Always start with the fill light. The fill light is a neutral ambient light that evenly illuminates the character. HDRIs are ideal for this fill light. You should choose a neutral HDRI that won't affect your materials and textures. Fill light is an additional light source. It helps to illuminate the whole character overall, especially in the shadowy areas. Fill light should not be clearly visible to the viewer, and this is an interesting thing. When we add our lights, such as key light and rim light, we reduce the intensity of the fill light to avoid overlighting the scene. Here you can see a render scene lit only with the fill light using the HDRI image. The intensity here is high, slightly more than default. I want to attract your attention one more time to the fact that I recommend starting setting up the materials and the character specifically with the fill light. By the way, this is a standard HDRI from the collection that comes from Marmoset, so use it. Key light. This is the main source of lighting for the character. It is light which we use to make accents on the render and to control attention of the viewer. It silently tells the viewer where to look first. It is obvious that the attention falls at the brightest part of the character first. Key light creates noticeable contrasts, which are exactly what we need for our beauty renders. The best choice for creating the key light is the spotlight. The primary goal of the key light is to create a light shadow pattern on the character. In our case, we light one part of the face, while another part of it remains partially in shadow. Typically, key light is positioned diagonally in front of the character. On this slide, you see the actual render and the layout diagram of the key light created with the spotlight. I also suggest looking at the screenshots of the light settings. You can see a screenshot with the settings of the spotlight, which is our key light, and above there is a screenshot of HDRI, which we set it up while talking about the fill light. You've probably already noticed that I reduced the intensity of the HDRI as I mentioned. When we move on to the rim light. By the way, I don't recommend changing the color of the key light too much because it can heavily change the materials and the texture look. If you really want to change it, at least do it to unsaturated shades. And finally, the rim light. The rim light, in my opinion, creates all this magic. The rim light, as you can see from the render, outlines the character. The rim light is a necessary light source to separate the character from the background, revealing the character's shape. You can create rim lighting using a spotlight or an omnilight. The lights are positioned either directly behind the character or diagonally behind. I will show now. In this render, the rim light is created using the omnilight and it is placed directly behind the character. You can also see the settings of this light on the slide. By the way, unlike the key light, here in the rim light, I highly recommend changing its color. The whole scene will look much more interesting. Here is an example of another rim light setup. This time I have two light sources. I've used two spotlights positioned diagonally behind the character, each one with a different color. You can see the settings and the placement of the lights in the screenshot. And the last example for this rim light setup. Here I'm using an omnilight and a spotlight. One is positioned directly behind the character and the other is positioned diagonally behind. This is the result we get on the render from such a lighting scheme. Mind please that the key light and the fill light are also present in this scene. Now let's review the most common mistakes which I often see in the works of beginners. The first example is when the key light is positioned directly above the character and gives harsh shadows. No doubt that in some cases this lighting scheme can be beneficial. However, such a setup will highlight all the imperfections of your sculpt. It's a great scheme if you want to portray a villainous character, but it is important to understand that if your sculpt is not perfect, it is better to avoid placing the key light straight above the character. The second example, the high intensity key light placed below the character. This kind of lighting makes the face look flat and the shadows appear weird. To make such lighting look appropriate, you need at least to work carefully on the expression of the character's face. The third example is an overlaid scene. Everything becomes flat, textures aren't visible, and even some objects disappear. And obviously there are almost no shadows. The first example, insufficient lighting of the scene. There are no contrast. Everything is lit more or less evenly, but the overall picture is dark and uninteresting because you can't see anything. The details, if there were any, would be lost due to the lack of light. Lastly, I would like to give you a few tips on adjusting lights in the render scene. So first, try to work with a few light sources as possible. Ideally, no more than 6 including HDRI. Managing 20 light sources in a scene can become too challenging, and it will not become impossible to avoid the overlighting. Also, adjust your lighting gradually. Start with the fill light, then the key light, followed by the rim light. Be mindful when adding additional lights. I highly recommend studying renders created by experienced artists and analyzing their lighting setups. Also pay attention to the lighting schemes in movies and cartoons. I love analyzing cinematic lightings and studying the camera angles there. And the last but not the least, take breaks. Step away from your computer to give your eyes and brain a rest. This is crucial because staring at the screen for a long time can lead to the difficulty distinguishing what looks good and what doesn't. So this is all that I wanted to cover in this lecture. I hope I've contributed to what you had known about lighting and render scenes. So now let's move to the technical lecture.